Welcome back to the World Crisis Radio. So we're discussing the monstrous inhumanity of the bankrupt Irish government, the Cowan-Lenihan regime in Ireland, coming forward with the worst austerity plan in the history of Ireland, at least in terms of government plans. I suppose we can compare it to the Irish potato famine back in the 1840s, when the British refused to dump food supplies onto the Irish market because it would violate the free market. Of course, you couldn't do that. You couldn't violate the free market. So the Irish had to either flee or die, and a lot of them died. I'm also thinking of Jonathan Swift's modest proposal back in the first half of the 18th century, right? Jonathan Swift, the great English satirist who had been driven out of the corrupt Hanoverian court life in London, had to take refuge in Dublin as dean of Trinity College in Dublin, Trinity Church, I guess it is. And there he was. And, of course, he said, let's make a modest proposal that, a young human infant, properly fed for a while, could then become a great cash crop, right? They could be sold for meat. And, of course, the satire and the irony of this is so overwhelming that it echoes across almost 3 centuries. What we're going to hear soon, we've got one modest proposal from the Cowan-Lenihan people, the 140-page National Suicide Plan for Ireland. Then, of course, we're going to have the International Monetary Fund come in, and we'll have to hear what they have to say. Will they say that the Cowan-Lenihan plan is sufficient? And, of course, we've got the Eurogawks and Eurocrats in Brussels, all of these little mice like Van Rompuy, members of the Bilderberg and puppets of U.S.-British finance capital. What a Europe we have. Also, the lessons of Heinrich Brüning, and we've talked about this repeatedly, from 1930 in the springtime to 1932 in the summer. Heinrich Brüning presided over the most draconian, brutal, up to now, sustained exercise in austerity that the Western world has seen. The net result, of course, was to destroy the German social, political, and economic system, to destroy the party system, and to open the door for Hitler and the National Socialists. We'll be seeing what this turns out to be. But remember, the irony of the entire austerity project is that it doesn't work in its own terms. It's always a failure in its own terms. Even Keynes points it out. We have to be more vehement and more exact than Keynes. But this is really an open secret. If you have a depressed economy where the private sector has been decimated by bankruptcies and the consequences of a speculative bubble coming down, the entire national economy depends on government economic activity. Now, there's different ways to organize that. We prefer using the inherent sovereign lending power of a government. Seize your central bank, start issuing 0% national credit for economic development, and you'll get a recovery. Build your infrastructure. Ireland needs a railway system, among other things. But if you do it that way, you can avoid the problems of doing it on budget, right? The deficits and related stuff. Although some things have to be on budget, and the deficit is a much overblown problem compared to depression. The worst thing that you want to avoid is depression. A deficit, ultimately, especially if it's held internally, can be dealt with. But the second round, once you've made those cuts, the deficit is going to be bigger. And that's the obvious thing. You've taken, in this case, you're taking 25 to 30,000 public sector workers in Ireland. They're not going to be taxpayers anymore. They're going to become recipients of unemployment benefits or the dole or whatever there is. And, of course, naturally, the Republicans would come and say, well, let's abolish those, too, so we'll save money on that. It's impossible. And the proof of the pudding now is Greece. Greece has now been under a draconian austerity regime for about 6 months. What's the story there? The International Monetary Fund now says that the Greek austerity, which had been approved as enough, is not enough. Because what are they finding? The IMF is finding that the Greek deficits are increasing. And the Greek deficits are increasing precisely as a result of the lunatic crackpot deficit austerity plan that the IMF and its stooges had imposed in the first place. So you go through all of this blood, sweat, and tears, and death, because it does bring death. It does, program of this dimensions kills people. and at the end of it, your deficit is bigger than it was before. What do you do now? More austerity, says the IMF. They just never learn. They want you to balance a budget in a depression. We're back to Herbert Hoover. We're really back to Andrew Mellon when it comes to this. Now, we're told that the Irish unions are going to have protests on the weekend after the U.S. Thanksgiving. This is fine, but we've now seen it in Greece. We've seen it in France. The problem is that the Second International, Socialist International leadership of these unions is programmatically bankrupt. Remember, in Greece, they didn't even dare call for the Papandreou government to fall. They don't have any programmatic ideas. They don't call for a bank tax. They don't call generally for a Tobin tax. Make this a centerpiece of agitation so that the entire society becomes aware of this issue. The issue of the Wall Street sales tax, the tax on speculative financial turnover, which means basically most financial turnover of the big institutions, that has to be brought forward. And then you need to have a recovery program. You've got to take action against speculation, but you've also got to have the 0% national credit to finance your national infrastructure program and your national science drivers. None of these Second International unions, parties, the socialists, so-called, of Greece, Portugal, and Spain have any idea of this any more than this Fianna Fáil right-wing gaggle around Cowan and Lenihan. So it's unfortunately not going to work. We're told that Portugal today, the day before the U.S. Thanksgiving, we're having the biggest general strike in 20 years in Portugal. Well, can we at least bring down this Socrates? We saw Obama hobnobbing with Socrates, the Prime Minister of Portugal, at the NATO summit this past week. Can we at least get this guy out? Can we get somebody else in? No, it's not going to happen. So this is now a very, very dark situation for Europe. What we need is people to organize, even in small groups, on the basis of program, of having the solutions. We just saw, for example, on Bloomberg television, the lady representing the National Union of the Unemployed in Ireland. So what's her program? Does she want to say, tax the banks, Wall Street sales tax, Robin Hood tax, Tobin tax on these banks, and we'll use that money to avoid the cuts? No, she just says, we ask the government not to be so severe, that they shouldn't cut the social safety net that much. And ultimately, the effect of this is pathetic. The petty bourgeoisie is always looking to see who is stronger, which way should we go? And this kind of stuff gets you nowhere, right? You're told that people are going to be destitute. We knew that anyway. We don't need the National Union of Unemployed to tell us that people are going to be destitute. Some people are going to die. We know that too. What's the plan? Where's the battle plan? Where are the marching orders? What's the program to get out of this crisis? So we're told now that the crisis then marches on to Spain by way of Portugal, perhaps. We're told that the spread between the German Bund, right, the German bonds, German treasury bills, treasury bonds, and the Spanish treasury equivalents, that the credit default swap rates indicate that the spread is growing and that the divergence between Spain and Germany is now the most that it's ever been during this entire crisis of the last year. The estimate is from the finance capital circles that Spain, if Spain is going to get bailed out, they would need about 900 billion euros. That would essentially wipe out the fund that had been created by the European Union back in May under U.S. pressure, because the Irish are getting, the Greeks got about 100 billion of it, euros, and the Irish are getting something like 100 billion euros. And if Spain needs 900 billion, then surely there's nothing left. That's not the answer. Shut down the zombie banks. You cannot sacrifice the entire Irish nation on the altar of 2 or 3 idiotic zombie banks and their failed derivative speculation. Wipe them out. Wipe the slate clean and let the chips fall where they may. Back in a minute on World Crisis Radio.